now.
Okay.
The big maneuver, here we go.
All
Change of roles. And we are going to go ahead and get started, everybody. Thank you all for coming. We've got a great turnout. We're over 100 registrants here today, which is fantastic. Thank you all for coming. This is number 10 in our series of webinars that we've been conducting since mid-March. So I don't know if you're tired, but I am. I'm looking forward to the weekend. We're so happy to have Leah here with us. She volunteered to do this for us. She is the expert. DEAC and ACCET have a great relationship going back since pretty much the dawn of time, I think, Leah. Leah's been a close friend to ACCET for years and years since you joined them in 2013, I believe it was. So thank you so much for doing this. After Leah does her presentation, and by the way, she's going to take chat questions throughout her presentation, so please put them right into the chat board. And I will be helping to watch, along with our team, Rez and Mary Claire, are going to be helping to watch for those as well. And they will jump in, Leah, and grab your attention if they think it's a question that deserves your immediate attention. Otherwise, they'll diplomatically wait until a good time. And then following Leah's presentation, any questions, then Judy Hendrickson has some updates for us from a small commission meeting we had earlier this week, with some additional flexibilities relative to distance learning approval. So that's going to be pretty important. We are going to record this beginning, oh, Rez is already recording it. Thank you, Rez. Recording it, and the slide deck will be available on Judy's blog sometime following the meeting. So give us time to get the recording from Zoom, and we'll try to get that up before the end of the day. So with that, Leah, if you're ready, why don't you go ahead and get started?
I'm ready to start. I can't seem to get what I want to share.
Shared.
John.
It's shared, and then it disappeared. It went on and off and on.
It's not sharing my presentation. I don't know why, but I guess we have to go to Plan B.
Plan B. I will share my screen where
You
I happen
will
to
share
have this
your screen.
Let me do that right now.
We're going to just have to work together, John.
We will do that. I'm sure with all aplomb, like we were old pros. Let me kill my video.
Like we've done this a million times. I don't know why my, is not sharing. But if you can, that works for me. If you want, I'm happy to. If you want to go to the presentation mode, that's fine as well.
Okay. Well, I will do that. Let me move my bar out of the way here.
Okay.
Slideshow, and come on. Here we go from the beginning.
Okay.
And are you guys able to see that now? Rez, can you give me a thumbs up or a yes? Audio?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Excellent.
Yes,
thank
we
you, guys. Thanks, everybody. Leah, it's all yours. Leah, thank you.
Well, here I am in my office in Washington, D.C. I'd much prefer to be in person with all of you because I enjoy attending your conferences. I thought you had a terrific event in Phoenix last year. And, your meetings are a real highlight for me. I've been in touch with Judy quite a bit over the last 2 months as accreditors are trying to respond to this COVID crisis. It's my hope that all of you are keeping safe and well, that your families are safe, and that you're finding your way through this very, very difficult time. At DEAC, we've been continuing with teleworking, with working with our schools, with trying to figure out virtual visits and a number of things. In the midst of this COVID situation, all of a sudden, new definitions and new terminology was proposed on April 1, no joke, to redefine distance education and a few other areas that were covered in that April 1 NPRM. And as I talked with Judy and John about these developments, they asked if I would come to you with a webinar to kind of hit the high points on these developments. Even though many of you may not have integrated distance learning in your programs, you might very well be thinking about some implementation this summer or even in the fall as we're all dealing with COVID. What I wanted to share with you is where we are in terms of the development of new language. It's not final. So to be clear,
can I get interrupted a second? Your voice is breaking up, and I don't know if that's just on my end or if everybody's having trouble.
I don't know.
Mary Claire, can you let me know?
She sounds good.
Sounds good. Okay, it's just me then. Go ahead.
She sounds
Thanks, Leah.
good.
Excellent.
Right.
Great.
Thanks.
Good.
Well, just to be clear, the material that I'm covering today is the proposed changes that were accomplished through negotiated rulemaking that took place over a year ago. Some of you might remember from various federal updates that there was a massive negotiating process that the Department of Education undertook last year. They had 3 subcommittees. I served on one of those subcommittees, which was the Distance Education and Innovation Subcommittee. We sent language on the definition of distance education and a few other areas, state authorization, that went to a main committee. Many of you know Michael McComas. He was the lead negotiator representing accreditation on the main committee. When they announced their November 1 changes to accreditation, distance education wasn't mentioned. Many of us thought it was just never going to happen. And then April 1 came and went. So let me go ahead and continue, John. If you would just kind of pop down to slide number 3, you can kind of skip over my contact information. But let's go start here with the credit hour definition. And you might be wondering, well, why is Leah mentioning credit hour if she's talking about changes to distance education? The reason I want to talk about the proposed changes to the credit hour is that there are some nuances here that do feature distance education. What I've done is I've put the current language side by side for you so you can have a look at it. This definition has been in place since I think about 2010. It has been a subject of much debate as to whether it is the place of the Department of Education to define a credit hour. That's going to remain in effect, but they're proposing some changes. And this one I think is significant. They are adding language here to say a credit hour is an amount of student work defined by an institution as approved by the institution's accrediting agency or state approval agency. And John, if you move down one more slide, please. Another important change is taking into account different delivery methods. And so in this kind of side-by-side presentation of credit hour definition, in number 2, bullet number 2, permits an institution in determining the amount of work associated with a credit hour to take into account a variety of delivery methods. And what this signals is the department's willingness to be flexible and innovative as it reaches the calculus of credit hour. So when this language becomes final, and we have no idea what that may be, it's going to be upon the accreditors to offer their guidance about how they might make changes to the credit hour definition and whether this variety of delivery methods in the accreditor rules will feature distance education, correspondence education, direct assessment, competency-based, all of those things. And I'm going to talk about direct assessment, competency-based education a little bit later in this presentation. Are there any questions, John, about the credit hour definition changes? If you attended the C-SPEN presentation I did a couple weeks ago, this is a little bit of a repeat of that conversation. I just think it's important that everybody kind of know where we are with this definition for credit hour. For those of you that operate in the credit hour domain, this will be something important to follow up on when the language becomes final.
Resident Mary Claire, any questions for Leah at this point in time?
Not in the chat so far.
Okay, well, we can always come back to it. Let's continue, John, because I'd like to go ahead and start talking about the distance education definition. You can go past that. Just one more slide. So at the root of the issue defining distance education is correspondence courses. And the Department of Education has held that a certain percentage of offering correspondence course does not make the institution eligible for financial aid if it exceeds certain percentages. And a number of large-scale distance education institutions, especially within the last 5 years ago, ran into a buzzsaw with a program review when their distance education programs that they thought were compliant with the federal definition were in fact deemed to be correspondence education. What this means is online teaching and learning didn't meet the federal definition of distance education and the regular and substantive interaction that is required to meet that definition. Next slide, John. And so there are some changes to the correspondence course definition, and then I'll get into the federal definition of distance education. Even though the delivery may be online and all of the teaching and learning is taking place using technologies, a program or a course can get deemed in the correspondence category. And there's a change here regarding the calculus of what is determined to be a correspondence course. What's new here is the addition of a paragraph that says the student's enrollment in correspondence courses constitutes more than 50% of the courses in which the student enrolled during an award year. So we've kind of gone to 3 metrics from 2. The current language is an institution is not eligible if the institution offers more than 50% of its courses by correspondence, or enrolls 50% or more of its students in correspondence courses, or, with the new proposed language, the student on an individual basis enrollment is in correspondence courses more than 50% during an award year. If you're an institution offering distance education, you want to make sure that you're staying in the category of the federal definition of distance education. Move us on here, John. 2 slides. So let's talk about the federal definition of distance education and make sure everybody understands the significance of this difference as it relates to correspondence. Here's the current definition under 34 CFR 600.2. Distance education means education using one or more of the technologies listed below. For students who are separated from the instructor to support regular and substantive interaction. There are 3 very pesky words in there: instructor, regular, and substantive. Continue, John. So these 3 words were kind of at the heart of institutions getting into difficulty. Maybe some of you remember a report that was done on Western Governors University a couple years ago. That report claimed that the instructors at Western Governors were not engaged in regular and substantive interaction, that the institution's programs did not meet the definition of distance education, and that Western Governors should repay approximately $700 million in federal financial aid for all of the award years where students were not, in terms of this program review process, meeting that federal definition. Luckily, Betsy DeVos came along very soon after, put that report in a drawer, and we didn't hear anything about it ever since. And it also prompted a great conversation about the importance of these 3 words and what the Department of Education means by regular and substantive. Many of us in the community, whether it's WCET, the Online Learning Consortium, Quality Matters, DEAC, NC SARA, all of us that work on a regular basis with distance education programs wrote many a letter. We wrote directly to Ted Mitchell requesting clarification on what the department expects to see in its audits of regular and substantive interaction. So when the current administration convened negotiated rulemaking around this definition, I was happy to see that it was finally getting some attention and that there was a determined effort to get input from the field. So let me talk with you now on the next slide, John, about what the proposed definition seeks to clarify in terms of regular and substantive and instructor. So the first part of the definition, it clarifies in more modern practice the kinds of technologies that can be used to offer distance education. So this was an important update. You can see that we're still considering distance education as separation from the instructor or instructors to support regular and substantive interaction. Next slide, please, John. So we're clarifying instructor. One of the issues that many of us paid attention to in the Western Governors situation was that they were using a distributed enterprise system of instruction that worked really, really well for their students and their model. They use a subscription-based approach for their tuition, and so students within a 6-month increment can take as many courses as they can complete. And so they have a very unique and rather effective structure of using qualified faculty, tutors, coaches, other people involved in monitoring student progress, and they function as a team. It may not mean that in every instance of interaction, it is a faculty member that expressly meets the accrediting agency standards, but it's a team approach, certainly coordinated by qualified individuals. And so what this definition is attempting to accomplish is how there could be many different models of instruction. And so this handy little phrase underlined for emphasis, you know, who meet the qualifications for instruction established by the institution's accrediting agency. So there we see again, this language is referring to the accreditor's important role in determining the qualifications of faculty and how those faculty will be appropriate in carrying out the rest of this definition, which is the regular and substantive piece. So let's talk about what is substantive. The committee that I worked with spent a lot of time trying to craft what we thought would be the most flexible yet meaningful terms to ensure accountability of education quality in distance education. So substantive interaction is engaging students in at least 2 of these things, you know, providing direct instruction, perhaps in a synchronous format, assessment or feedback of student coursework, information or responding to questions on course content, facilitating group discussion, or other instructional activities, here we are again, as approved by the institution or program's accrediting agency. One thing that was important to the committee was that the substantive interaction was deliberately related to content, that it wasn't threaded discussion on unrelated things, that it was truly meaningful teaching and learning activities in the distance education format. The main committee accepted this language, and so we were glad to see that consensus and that this was coming forward. Now let's talk a little bit about regular. Go ahead, John. And so under the clarification for regular, what constitutes, you know, the expectation for how often you are going to engage in this kind of substantive activity. Regular interaction is providing the opportunity for these substantive engagements between students on a predictable and regular basis. We were able to convince the department that like a once per week, you know, dictation of this requirement probably wouldn't be effective in every learning scenario, and that we wanted it to be more related to the content and subject under study, and that students and faculty kind of worked around a predictable and regular schedule of instruction. And monitoring academic engagement and success and ensuring that an instructor is responsible for promptly and proactively engaging in interaction. The language forwarded by the subcommittee, you should know, didn't have that little word "and" that I circled in red. What it had was "or," that we thought there should be flexibility on the part of the institution or program working with the accreditor to get this kind of regular interaction sorted out. Somewhere between the main committee and publication, the little word "or" was changed to "and." And so I had actually put in my written comments that I submitted on May 4th, that, you know, if we're making that change, then we had better be very clear about what kinds of evidence and documents institutions should be providing through their learning management systems to have all of this in place and to show that the federal definition of distance education is being met. I think it's important for every school to have a conversation about this. If we're going to move into more distance education in the future, we can probably expect that program reviews somewhere along the way are going to start looking at the regular and substantive interaction between students at this time. I know there's a lot of flexibility and understanding right now, especially as we may be wrapping up the spring term. But future plans for distance education, I would advise you, if you're working in distance education with ACCET and the IDL standards that they have, that you are also paying attention to the current definition for distance education, which I provided a few slides ago, and an awareness should the final language be adopted by the department. And it may very well be because of how institutions are responding to COVID with distance ed. The documentation of this can't be understated in its importance. DEAC sends a specialist that we have trained in this area on every single visit for our Title IV participating schools and programs that receive financial aid for students. We're happy to share resources, provide training, whatever we can do to support the ACCET group. You know, you're just wonderful partners, a great part of the community. We're happy to help. I've just wanted to make sure that there is an understanding and conversations happening, even if you don't think you're doing distance education right now. One doesn't know how the future might unfold for how we engage with our students in the rest of the year. So John and Mary Claire, before I talk about some of the other components, competency-based, direct assessment, also going to have some fun with state authorization towards the end of this conversation. Does anybody want to talk about some questions about this definition?
I think some questions have come in.
Okay.
My screen is blocked with the full presentation, so Rez or Mary Claire are going to jump in for us.
Sure. There's one question that's come in, and it's a question about the proposed changes. Is there a time frame for when the proposed changes will be accepted?
Good question.
Or rejected.
Well, this is consensus language. So okay. This is language that the negotiated rulemaking committee, the main committee, agreed to adopt with the department. The department didn't announce it until April 1. They're fairly obligated to publish in final form a fairly close version of this. When they're going to do that, nobody knows. Everything I'm hearing about what's going on in the department is that they are putting all of their effort and resources into CARES Act implementation right now. But I think we should keep our eyes open, because part of CARES Act is also considerations for more distance education this summer and this fall. So it would be a good thing to have this definition in place as we have more award years for students.
Any other questions, Rez or Mary Claire? I think for those in the audience.
Actually, Linda has a question. Yeah, Linda has a question about this, and she wants to know if you, Leah, feel that these changes work to the advantage of the schools or students.
I definitely think there is an advantage to clear understanding of regular and substantive and faculty. I also think that there's an advantage to the accreditor playing a more proactive role in that approval process. So that gives the institution some cover. You know, hey, we're operating this in accordance with what our accreditor approved we could do in distance ed. It does raise the spectrum on the accreditor, like we get scrutinized too, as you know, by the Department of Education. But I definitely think this is a major improvement. We saw far too many institutions. In fact, there was even one at DEAC that was, it was switched to, excuse me, pollen folks, it's a little pollen allergy.
Okay, phew. I can take my mask off now, can I?
But we had a school at DEAC that was moved to the reimbursement system of payment because they were found to be out of compliance somehow with the federal definition of distance education. And I couldn't get answers as to what was not in place because we had done our process, and for us, we felt like regular and substantive interaction was in place by qualified faculty. It was a 12-month ordeal, and finally they were removed from heightened cash monitoring and everything was reinstated. I think this language is a big improvement upon what was unknown to be now more clear.
I can just add a little comment if you don't mind, Leah. The ACCET document 3.0 IDL, which has been around since the mid-90s, 1996 actually is when it was founded. It's been changed, of course, over time, but the element of substantive interaction has been a part of that. Student to student, student to content, student to faculty is integral to that document. So those of you who have, of course, have previously approved IDL and have had site visits, that's something that the team would have looked at. And for those of you applying for the first time, what Leah is talking about is an integral part of that on-site visit. We're of course looking at it in your application itself prior to granting interim approval. But with the on-site visit, we'll be looking at discussion forums, grading, we'll be looking at last day of attendance and how you're tracking those things, all which go back to academic work completed and substantive interaction. So, again, I can't personally give you safe harbor. I can just tell everybody here that the regs as written with ACCET are pretty compatible with this. We'll be looking at these new drafts too, Leah, and of course seeing if we need to make some refinements. But I think we're pretty darn close.
There's one more question that's just come up from Candace. She asked if this new standard will be across the board, or is it just for schools that have that receive Title IV funds?
So this is just for Title IV participating institutions. DEAC accredits many schools that are not in Title IV at all. We still look at how faculty and students are interacting, but they don't have the kind of documentation and Title IV program reviews that their financial aid participating counterparts have. And one of the the reasons DEAC has a two-step process in its accreditation, where adding Title IV as a substantive change, is it does give us flexibility to have different processes for schools that aren't in Title IV that want to have more competency-based or more direct assessment-based programs not in the Title IV space.
For ACCET schools, by the way, 3.0 IDL applies equally. Whether you're vocational, avocational, language program, it doesn't matter. Those standards require across the board. And Leah, as you mentioned, the documentation requirement, of course, those who are Title IV are going to be dotting all their I's and crossing all their T's.
Absolutely. And you have to plan for the technology. You have to plan for a learning management system that is going to capture this data. Yeah. And you have to also integrate good instructional design. The curriculum by design has to feature how this is provided and documented.
Excellent. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Well, we can continue. There might be one more question. What can we?
Yeah. Nope, that was just a reply of saying, yes. What shall we do to increase the engagement between training institution and their customers this period of time, especially during the COVID-19 virus? It said, and then you may know many institutions here in Jordan, and I think all over the world, stop nominating their employees.
Mm-hmm. Certainly in some situations where institutions aren't equipped to offer distance education, they had to put a stop on the enrollment and kind of a stop on the education program. For an institution operating in Jordan that doesn't have some of the federal financial aid features, I think that there's some flexibility for you to work that out with ACCET and how they want to treat that situation that's very unique to outside the United States and how COVID is affecting those students. It's especially important to understand that access issues are running rampant all over the world, where students don't have access to high-speed internet, where they don't have access to computer equipment, they don't have access to connectivity. So it's a major issue that needs to be addressed on an individual basis, which is going to fall between ACCET and the institution.
And we'll be happy to talk to that institution separately about that as well.
So let's talk about a few other things that were proposed that came through the negotiated rulemaking process, John. Go ahead and move us on to subscription-based. And so there is language that will allow for subscription-based programs that doesn't require a certain specific time frame. And so an institution can work with their accreditor if they want to institute a subscription-based program, sort of like the Western Governors University model, where there's kind of a direct assessment of student progress as they're going along. So they can knock out a course in 3 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, you know, whatever they want to accomplish in that term. And so this is now written into the language. It used to be an experimental sites only approval process. Now the proposal is that all institutions can apply and accreditors can establish standards around subscription-based programs. Whether or not ACCET decides they want to get into this role is going to be up to them, and working with you to figure out the best process and model for you. Go ahead and one more slide here, John, about how competency-based education would apply to subscription programs where students are learning at their own flexible pace. Curriculum is focused on competencies, and students have lots of access to resources, tutoring to get them through. I just want to remind you, I put a little asterisk with some tiny lettering, but RSI, that's regular substantive interaction, still has to be in place, even if you're in a subscription-based format and you're working in competency-based. So again, only a few, like I think there was like 7 institutions that were participating in the Experimental Sites Initiative, offering Title IV eligible competency-based education programs, some with subscriptions. Now this new language is proposing that all institutions and all accreditors can work with this. But just remember, RSI, if you want to do this.
By the way, ACCET has a competency-based education work task force in place right now that's meeting regularly. Maybe that qualifies as regular and substantive meeting regularly. Judy, do you want to speak to that now, or you want to speak to it later after Leah's finished? Any thoughts, Judy? See if Judy's gets her microphone on. If not, now we'll talk about it later.
I can do it later.
Okay, Judy, thanks a lot. Great.
Okay.
Thanks, Leah.
Yeah, so just then one more slide, John, going into direct assessment. And so a small subset of competency-based programs are classified as direct assessment. There's a lot of debate about how is direct assessment any different from competency-based education. There really isn't no firmly established authority on this. I just see kind of direct assessment as a subset of competency-based, and you know what makes direct assessment different is that it's not tied to credit hours as the kind of default measurement for student learning. Competency-based education maps back to credit hours. Direct assessment doesn't. But again, if the accreditor decides to adopt direct assessment standards and competency-based, regular and substantive still has to be in place. Again, there were just a very few schools participating in the direct assessment experimental site. I'm not in a huge hurry to do this. Between you and me, I'd kind of rather wait until after November to see kind of where we are with our situation at the department before we start any grand changes to our standards about direct assessment. So John, the next slide up is just Q&A. If we want to have any further conversations about the federal definition, all of these fun terms, how much fun we're going to have documenting regular and substantive interaction by qualified faculty in our learning management systems. We're all going to avoid getting mistaken for correspondence course. So everybody here knows you don't want to get into that correspondence course bucket by mistake. So,
any other questions for
Kat
Leah at this point?
Kat is asking if you can give examples of RSI.
So examples of regular substantive interaction is like a synchronous lecture where students attend and hear like a instruction or presentation from faculty. Regular and substantive interaction is grading or assessment of student work that provides the student with feedback that is kind of specific to them. It can be like a threaded discussion or a discussion activity about a topic under consideration as part of the course, just as long as the discussion shows that there is kind of meaningful understanding by the student expressed in that threaded discussion. It can be a group assignment where there's evidence of students kind of meeting on their own time, showing that they are making progress towards a group presentation or an assignment. It can also be faculty feedback on a student presentation, a paper, a thesis. When the testing is done, it's kind of random sampling. They'll go into the learning management system and they'll grab some samples of RSI. If the sample shows that it's in place, then it stops. If it's not well established at first, then they'll keep looking and looking and looking to try to get a handle on the evidence of RSI.
Other questions there? Very clear, Rez?
Yes, there are several other questions. Daphne, she asked to kindly put the definition up one more time. I'm not sure if, I think that Dr. Matthews probably answered the question about RSI, which is regular substantive interaction. Another question would be, and Daphne, if I'm wrong, just please respond in the chat. Linda asked, I'd appreciate some further discussion on qualified instructor.
Qualified instructor is going to depend on your accreditor. Likely a qualified instructor is going to have to meet certain degree requirements, content area, expertise. What this definition is looking for is that the instructors or instructor team that is providing regular and substantive interaction has met the qualifications established by the accreditor. And so, before accreditors would cry foul when RSI violations were found by the department, accreditors would say, well, hey, who are you to decide what's going on in an institution we accredit for education quality? So there was some of that going on. This language is kind of a response to be more deferential to the accreditor's determination of the faculty qualification.
Let me see if I can put Judy on the spot here again. Judy, would it be correct to say that if a school is putting out an instructor who's qualified to teach it in residence, ACCET does not have a particular additional requirement to teach distance learning except the training and support that they get from the school. But if the instructor is qualified to teach the course in residence, would that indeed meet the requirement of a qualified instructor for ACCET?
Yes, and ACCET has specific requirements for instructor qualifications and certain special programs. So for nursing, massage therapy, ESOL, but otherwise has more general language about what constitutes a qualified instructor.
Good, thanks, Judy. That's very helpful. I think what you want to avoid, and that's some of the models that you were alluding to, Leah, where putting a mentor up there to facilitate who's not otherwise qualified to teach the course,
right,
pretty clearly doesn't fit this
Right.
definition. Yeah.
Especially if the mentor isn't under any kind of supervision or oversight or team teaching arrangement with someone who's qualified. I mean, sometimes class sections can be quite large, and you will have a teaching assistant support the qualified faculty member, but it's certainly a curriculum design, and it's a team teaching arrangement with proper oversight of that instruction.
Very good. I think hopefully that answers the question that was posed. Yeah.
We have another question from Terry, who is interested in knowing what LMS systems other schools are using that meet the documentation requirements. And Sean was following up on that too. Similar question, and is adding, what if a school has developed their own system using various platforms or tools?
I've seen both. Most DEAC schools are using Canvas these days because it has some very nice built-in features and reporting that can be used for this process. We have some DEAC schools that have their own homegrown, developed management systems that they've been working on for many, many years, proprietary to them, that have these reporting functions built in. Another really good way for schools to show that they're meeting this requirement is that they have a detailed manual for faculty, that they have built-in accountabilities for faculty to kind of have some internal reporting to the school, so there, there's some monitoring going on about faculty making sure that they're hitting these marks for regular and substantive. So you can have a terrific management system, but if you don't have policies and procedures built in with adequate kind of supervision of the implementation, then an LMS may not be as effective as you would hope.
It's the tools that you use, and the devil's in the details, isn't it? A lot of our schools have used Moodle or playing with Moodle or various iterations of Moodle, and there's hundreds of different variations of Moodle out there, right? Some people are still using Blackboard, so there's lots of things. But yeah, having those controls, you know exactly when academic work was completed, you showed that the instructor is qualified and is involved, then you're, again, pretty far down the pike. Again, I can't offer you a safe harbor with that, but you're not doing nothing, that's for sure.
Right.
There's another question. Will there be an accelerated process for adding distance learning to current standard non-distance accredited schools?
That's probably one I should take there. Yes, there is, whoever the questioner is, and I think, of course, our last several webinars were focused exactly on that. So maybe if the person asking the question could drop me an email message, and I can refer them to some of the resources, and of course have a follow-up phone call.
We have another question about the advantages that's regarding required interactions if the course is a blended or hybrid model.
Well, a blended or hybrid model would need to be determined by ACCET. You're getting into that calculus also of hybrid, a whole other kind of a question, because it kind of depends on the percentages that are being allocated to the distance format, and then the percentages that are being allocated towards the on-campus format. I think where you have to look is going back to that kind of 50% correspondence course definition that I showed you, and kind of see where you're starting to trigger into a majority distance ed that would then need to lead to this RSI in the distance ed format. I'm not very good with hybrid because we just don't have a lot of that in DEAC.
It's very common in our membership to have hybrid,
right.
And in that mix of activities. That's what's happening online. The flipped classroom, of course, comes into play there. So there's all kinds of pedagogy that goes around that. So it's not a simple question for Leah to answer, or even for me to answer in one fell swoop. So yeah, hybrid gives you all kinds of opportunities to mix and match. But it doesn't mean that you can leave your students alone online for part of the week and then make it up on Friday afternoons when they're live in class. That's not going to be an appropriate mix. So the interaction should be spread across both learning modalities, both teaching modalities, and exactly what that mix is, again, is probably a conversation we'd have to have a little bit more depth another time, but it's not all one or the other. There's no one perfect solution for everybody. Good.
There's
So we
another
almost stumped the
question.
band in that, Leah.
We still have a few more questions. So one is, are there any limitations or qualifications from the tools that are used in IDL?
Well, that might be a question for ACCET, I'm not sure. I mean, as long as you're meeting the accreditor's criteria for, faculty qualification, there shouldn't be any limitation. I guess maybe, John, you have a better answer to reply.
I'm not sure we're ready for holograms yet, but maybe, I don't think there's anything written that says you can't do what you can't do. But again, that might be a question. If you got something in mind, we can put it out to a vote. But I'm not seeing anything. Again, the learning technology has advanced quite a bit. There's so many good tools out there and right now, and you're not typically restricted on the face of it from using those tools. It's a roundabout way of answering your question, is I don't know the answer to your question, but we'll work on it.
Daniel is asking the $1 million question here, if there will be an extension beyond the June 1st deadline. And
Let's
I'm
see
not
that
sure.
for Judy.
Provide a little bit of context, and then maybe Judy and John can fill in. What I'm hearing, there's no direct announcement to accreditors, but what I'm hearing is, as long as a national emergency is in effect, that the Department of Education can be flexible with accreditors, and then by extension, accreditors can be flexible in their kind of rapid response in reviewing distance education. Again, I don't know what bearing that would have on ACCET's policies, but that's kind of the baseline of what I've heard about how long this can continue.
Judy, you want to grab that one now, or you want to save that hot potato for later?
Save it.
A pregnant pause, and we will save that. But Judy, we'll get to that after Leah's finished. We are getting some private questions, and just so you all know, I love the questions privately, but I'm having a little trouble navigating them with the slides and the whole thing. So if you don't mind either sharing them to everybody or emailing those to me directly, that'd be great. And I'll give you some more information about reaching out to staff as we get towards the end of the webinar. Thanks.
John,
Keep them coming.
There's one more question. What is your opinion on schools considering switching to IDL versus reopening their brick and mortar at the start of June or July? And the second part is, if a school reopens, will ACCET or another body be taking measures to ensure that they're meeting certain safety standards?
I'm going to put that over to Judy too, if you don't mind.
Well, I mean, converting, a traditional, faculty teaching model that's done on campus to distance education is a considerable leap, and it's considerable resources. It really is not just an addition of distance education, but it could represent a change in mission. And so, that's, of course, what's on everybody's mind is what to do this summer, what to do this fall. I think it's important to plan for more distance education, but a complete conversion might trigger a cascade of other kinds of substantive changes for your accreditor. And maybe John or Judy want to direct that question, to maybe the end of the webinar, but I'm sure that there's many of you that have similar thoughts in mind.
I think we'll probably, some of these asset-specific questions, I think we may want to hold for Judy after Leah's presentation. I think we've got some answers to some of those. I think it's safe to say that our schools have been very careful. They've been working. We've been in touch with a lot of them, so I'm not too worried about that. But from an accreditation standpoint, the Wild Wild West can't continue indefinitely. So ACCET is pretty much insisting on June 1st as a deadline for the first application. Again, that may be subject to a little bit of change, but no one should plan on that magically changing with ACCET, because it's not only a department decision, it's an ACCET commission decision. So we'll get back to that in a bit. Okay. Leah, you want to just push on for a little bit?
Sure, let's talk state authorization, only because it's an important feature of distance ed and kind of important to kind of know where we are with state authorization. You can keep going, John. Many of you may not have, whoops, not so
I hit the
far.
button or something, jump back. There we go. Is this the right one?
Yeah, stop right there.
Right there, got it.
Right there, we're good. Many of you may not give, the state authorization for distance ed a whole lot of consideration if your students are pretty much in a close regional geographic area to the institution that may not cross state lines. If you're a Title IV participating school, though, you have to make sure that you have state authorization for distance education activities in their state. So let's say you operate a school in, Southwest Pennsylvania, and you draw students from Wheeling, West Virginia, maybe a few from Ohio. If those students are starting to transition to distance education, I think it's important to start figuring out whether or not you're triggering something in that state where the students live for state authorization. This was a major issue that led to the creation of NC-SARA, which is reciprocity for degree granting authorities at the state level. There is no reciprocity for non-degree, although I wish that there was, and I am pushing SARA to please consider adding a division that would accommodate non-degree state authorization reciprocity. If you could go ahead one more slide here, John. So please, if you're looking at distance education for the longer term, in addition to the research and development you may need to do for regular and substantive interaction, also put a team or an individual on the task of evaluating where you may need to start exploring state authorization for distance education. You also need to be aware of any other oversight entity or licensing body that has ties to distance education state authorization. This is a compliance issue for Title IV. And I know we've all been implementing distance education on a rather rapid response basis, but what's really important is to do your research. Go ahead, John. Kind of do your research on where your students live and do your research at that state. If it's outside of your state of kind of permanent facility, that you've kind of figured out whether or not you're going to trigger something with that state, okay? You don't want to run afoul of the state attorney general deciding that you've been unauthorized offering distance education in their state.
Yeah.
Mary
There's
Claire?
a question. There's a question. Is there any easy access location to see all states and their distance education requirements?
I wish. Don't I wish? We all wish that there was some kind of centralized point. I am sorry to say there is not. There are some law firms that offer this as kind of a legal service if you want to pay to subscribe. I think Powers, Dow Lonis, maybe Hogan Lovells have some matrices that they update because the states change their rules all the time about what triggers physical presence, what doesn't. It is immensely complicated, and anything can trigger physical presence. What I mean by physical presence is you're operating a distance ed program out of your state, and sometimes advertising triggers it. Sometimes, a faculty member sitting outside of your state triggers it. You just really have to go through state by state where students are, where they reside, and see. If you're a degree granting institution, you can apply to NC-SARA for reciprocity. Okay. I wish I had a better, more satisfying answer. I think there might be another question or two, Mary Claire.
Yes. One just came in from Wendy. If the students are non-immigrants, i.e. still in their home country, or here on a non-student visa and are not considered residents or temporary residents at best. Do the state considerations apply?
Oh boy. I would think they probably don't if they're not, you know, kind of a subject of that state. That's probably a question for the state administrator. You know, Judy and I have been talking about some outreach to the states. We're thinking about putting together a meeting to try to get some clarity around answers like, what about state authorization during this kind of transition period where schools are still trying to figure out whether they're going to go distance education for a longer period of time or if it's just a stopgap measure. So maybe, you know, after a month or so, Judy and I will have some better answers around that.
And one more, Leah. California doesn't participate in NC-SARA. Do you know if there are any other agencies that would act like NC-SARA for schools in California?
Well, yes. California is not going to join NC-SARA anytime soon. I don't know how else that might work. One of the problems in California, at least for NC-SARA, is there's really no degree granting authority or kind of SHIO kind of office there that could join NC-SARA. They'd have to create some legislation, and there's a lot of resistance by consumer advocates in California of shaping up any kind of method that would allow any kind of reciprocity for any kind of institution. So if you're located in California, I'm sorry. You probably do a lot of work interacting with 49 states if you enroll students from every state in your distance ed program. Just ask some of the schools there that are big distance education participants. It's a major challenge. Again, probably not anything coming soon. Well, let me talk a little bit about some regulations going into effect July 1. These are for both distance education and on-ground institution. It has to do with disclosures as they relate to professional licensure. All institutions must provide general and direct disclosures for prospective and enrolled students about programs that lead to professional licensure. I don't know to what extent this impacts institutions at ACCET. You're likely already aware of it. I just wanted to make sure that I had a little plug here that you were remembering that this was coming up to be effective in July 1 as part of being eligible for Title IV. John, just one more slide and we're almost to the end.
Take your time, no rush.
Just wanted you to just have a level of awareness on digital accessibility. We're not talking about this as we rapidly convert to distance education. This was a major, major deal for the Obama administration, and they were working towards some federal rules around digital accessibility that never got legs. The Trump administration has a much lighter touch as it relates to digital accessibility, but just something else to keep in mind. You know, there isn't a specific standard under ADA for this. There is guidelines under a nonprofit organization called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG 2.0. So if you're looking at distance ed for the longer term, you know, another special project among all the other things you have going on would probably want to take a look at digital accessibility. Okay, just
Leah, could I ask you a question? Does DEAC provide its own guidance for its members on digital accessibility?
no, we have kind of taken the position that we don't interpret ADA. So we'll leave that to other experts, but we've provided workshops and sessions at our conferences. We've brought speakers to talk about institutions taking their own responsibility for ADA, converting their content to ADA kind of digital accessible content. If you're interested in some speakers, I think I did a session that touched on this a little bit at your conference, but it's likely gonna probably emerge another major issue in the coming months as we have more and more students working in an online format.
And Judy, is it correct that ACCET is pretty silent on this issue as well, right, currently?
So maybe just one more thing here, John. Just wanted ACCET schools to know that DEAC has launched a free assessment tool. This is 40 questions on kind of distance education effectiveness. It's completely free, it's completely anonymous, it's just a tool you can use for improvement. So you can register, take the online test, get a printout on where you are in kind of 4 categories: student disclosures, technology enterprise, academic quality, and future viability. We're offering this as just kind of a tool to assist the community if they want to see where they are on the spectrum of their sophistication and execution of distance ed. So you can do with that what you will.
Excellent. Maybe we'll get a link to that on our website as well for everybody.
Completely optional. And that kind of, I'm done. I'm done, John.
Oh, the thank you. There we go. The thank yous are there.
Well, thank
Cool.
you for having me. Boy, I sure do wish that we could be in person. I enjoy your conference events. And thank you, John. Thank you, Judy, Mary Claire, for having me today.
Thanks so much, Leah. And Judy, do you have any questions for Leah or anything you'd like to, before she punts
No,
away?
I thank you. I thank you so much, Leah, for
Okay.
participating in this. This is great.
This was
Okay,
really,
thanks.
really excellent. Thank you so much, Leah. I really appreciate it. And those of you with follow-up questions, we'll funnel them over to Leah if we can't answer them ourselves.
Please do. Happy to. And if you're going to have some additional Q&A about ACCET, I can duck out. Otherwise, thanks again.
You are
Thank you.
free to go, but you're not dismissed. You're free to go if you need to go. Don't worry.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Leah.
Thank
All right,
you.
take care.
Bye now.
Bye.
Couple quick words before Judy takes over here. Lots of questions. I couldn't see the chat board for the bulk of that, so Rez and Mary Claire, thank you for covering for me now that I can see my screen again. There were lots of questions about hybrid and little specifics about LMSs and things like that. A lot of that was covered. A lot of those items were covered or touched on in our prior webinars. All of those webinar PowerPoints are on Judy's blog on the website. We did not record the town hall meeting, but all the other webinars were recorded. There are PowerPoints for all of them there, as well as some additional handouts for each of them. So if you have questions about hybrid, things like that, the basics, the essentials of distance learning, I would go back to the March offering as a starting point, where a number of these issues were touched on. So that'd be a starting point for everybody. The other thing is, if you have questions specific to your school, we're always happy to answer those as well. As we like to conclude we're not concluding this webinar yet, so don't go away, Judy, but just remember that you can contact any of your favorite ACCET staff members. Pick one that you like and send him or her a message. And if you don't have a favorite or you have no friends at ACCET that you know of, you've got me, you've got Rez, so don't hesitate to contact Rez and myself. We like to hold ourselves out there as the default person to send a question to, and we will get it to the right place, again, if we can't answer it ourselves.
John, before
Yes.
Judy starts, Terry had one question. Did I hear correctly that non-degree granting schools may not be able to offer IDL across state lines?
Judy, I can kind of answer that, or I can start it. You can finish, or you can jump on it. Your choice.
Go ahead.
She's gonna wait till I take a deep dive, then she's gonna correct me. That's the way things work around here. Thankfully, we have each other. Terry, that's a tricky question. You heard Leah talk about a presence, a physical presence in the state. If you have a physical presence in another state, for example, recruiting office or a placement office or something like that, then you clearly cross the line, and that state is highly likely to want to regulate you. So it's not necessarily a question of degree granting or not. If you are vocational, in almost all states, vocational schools have to be licensed by the state in which they're operating. If you are not Title IV and you are operating, bringing in students from across state lines, that is, ACCET does not have a statement on that. But it could be that the Attorney General in another state where the student's coming from may have questions for you. So again, it depends on your region, where you're working, where you're operating, what those states are around you, and how they interpret this physical presence kind of traditional rule of law or interpretation of licensure. So that's kind of my best way of answering that question for you, because we can't offer you safe harbor. How did I do, Judy?
Yes, I would say that in terms of guidance, it's best to work in state until you're sure what the requirements are for operating and enrolling students out of state. So just check that out. But you're not prohibited. You're not prohibited from going across state lines. You just need to know whether or not you need prior approval from your neighboring states.
A long debate. This has been debated since the early 90s when distance learning became mainstream. Judy, why don't we turn this over to you? Do you want me to share that handout?
Yes, that'd be great. So what I want to talk about are two things. One is a streamlined IDL program application process, and then some of the activities and initiatives of ACCET with some additional modalities and approaches to education. You've already heard about some of the temporary flexibilities that the Commission has approved for the process. And they've actually this week approved 3 more. So there's 4 provisions that were previously approved, and you've been notified of those, and then 3 more that just were approved on Wednesday of this week. So I want to go through them.
Digging that out for you here in a second, Judy. Yep.
Yeah, that said, so the process is being streamlined. What is very important to realize is that in terms of the rigor and the application of the standards, that will be the same. ACCET is not relaxing any of that. So that means the requirement for regular and substantive interaction, that's applicable. That means that state approval, that's applicable. This is for when you go from temporary IDL emergency delivery to post-emergency, okay? So let me just run through the 4 provisions that the Commission previously approved, and then I'll get into the 3 that were just approved.
Can I double check? Can everybody see my screen on streamlined IDL program application?
No, we see you.
No, we can't.
And Judy.
Cannot.
Let me start this again. Sorry. I'm not seeing. There we go. There we go. Okay, let me start again.
And all of these temporary flexibilities, these are applicable for institutions that during this COVID-19 emergency on a temporary basis are delivering IDL. And this is for institutions that submit their first application for IDL, for an IDL program, by June 1st, 2020. And we're holding to that date because the department hasn't extended that date. We're waiting to see, and you will be notified if there are any changes, but please go with the June 1st, 2020 date until you hear otherwise, unless and until you hear otherwise. It's good to get your applications in early because we want to avoid, to the extent possible, any gap between the end of the emergency period and your approval to offer on a permanent basis IDL, okay? So the 4 things that have already been approved, the 4 provisions, one is that it's a streamlined application, so it's fewer questions that you have to respond to, and it's at a significantly reduced application and visit fee. So it's almost half price. It's $1,050 for the application. It's $2,000 regularly, and it's $2,400 for a virtual IDL program visit when it's normally twice that amount. The other is allowing for a virtual IDL program visit. That's going to be conducted by teleconference call, video conference, virtual meeting platform. And it will be conducted virtually unless it's done in conjunction with an on-site visit that's scheduled for reaccreditation purposes in 2020 or 2021. If you got visits scheduled in those time, reaccreditation visits, then it will be in conjunction with that. And then the third piece, excuse me, the fourth piece, provision that was previously approved is basically a waiver of a requirement for IDL. Currently, the requirement is that after you submit your first program for IDL approval, you have to demonstrate successful outcomes of graduates of that first approved IDL program before you're allowed to submit additional IDL applications. The Commission has waived that requirement. You do not have to demonstrate the successful outcomes of your graduates from your first program before you can submit additional programs. This is applicable for additional program applications that are submitted by December 31st, 2020. So this waiver isn't indefinite. It has a finite period. It's for applications, additional IDL applications that come in by December 31st. Now, what was just approved by the Commission, and let me just back up and say one thing. We are asking that you wait till you get interim approval for your first IDL program before you submit the additional applications. We were making that request. So then the three provisions that were just approved this week by the Commission. The first one is that this virtual program visit that will be conducted electronically, that there will be no requirement for a subsequent on-site program visit. The Department of Education is requiring that there be a follow-up on-site visit for reaccreditation purposes and for other substantive changes. But because of the IDL modality, because of the fact that we can observe from remotely your IDL programs, there won't be a requirement for a follow-up, a subsequent follow-up on-site program visit after the virtual visit. So that's one additional temporary flexibility. Another has to do with the timing of your interim approval. So the additional flexibility is that the Commission is allowing there to be retroactive approval of your IDL application if it's submitted by June 1st, 2020. And so what that means is that interim approval for your first IDL program will be granted retroactive to the date that a complete and fully compliant application is submitted and received by ACCET. And that may or may not be the date that you first submitted that initial IDL application, their first IDL program, because it's often true that there's a back and forth, that you actually have your application reverted and you have to provide additional evidence of compliance, or you have to make some other kinds of corrective actions. But when you have a complete and compliant application, that will become the retroactive date for your IDL approval. And again, this is because we're trying to eliminate a gap between the end of the emergency period and when you have full program approval or your full interim approval for
Judy,
IDL.
could you pause there for a second? Damon has a question.
Of course.
Asking is there going to be an allowance for temporary emergency admissions of new students post June 1st? And I think that flexibility you just described kind of goes to that.
So at the moment, June 1st is the deadline, and it's the payment period that begins by June 1st. So if your payment period extends beyond June 1st, you can continue to offer on a temporary basis your IDL. But in terms of new students, there could be a gap. There is not necessarily a bridge. There may be a gap between the end of the emergency period and the time you can bring on new students. Now mind you, that emergency period, the department may come out with a date after June 1st, and then the commission will make a determination as to whether they will extend beyond June 1st. But again, unless and until there's a change, June 1st is that magical date. Okay. And then the last provision has to do with your additional applications for additional IDL programs. So if your first program is submitted by June 1st, and then you subsequently submit additional programs before December 31st, then your subsequent programs, your subsequent IDL programs, will be approved or will be considered for approval as interim approval until your institution is granted final approval by the commission for the first IDL program. Remember that with the first IDL program, you are first granted interim approval, then you have your virtual visit after you've submitted your management report, and it goes to the full commission at the next meeting. So the team report and the response to your program team report go to the commission at the next meeting.
If some of you are confused by some of this verbiage and timelines, on May 1st, we had two webinars, one for the language schools and one for everybody else. They each lasted an hour and a half, and there's full recordings of those on the website, on the homepage in Judy's blog. Look for the May 1st recordings. We walk through exactly what Judy's just describing, the sequence of events, how your first program application goes, how the subsequent applications goes, how they're processed, and exactly the content of the streamlined applications and templates for completing those applications. So we don't have time today to go through that, but please, if you don't mind, watching that recording of May 1st, appropriate to your school type, and then shoot us some questions and we'll set up a time to talk. Thanks, Judy.
And just know that the commission is doing what it can to provide flexibilities, but as an accrediting agency recognized by the U.S. Department of Education, we also work within a regulatory framework, and so we can only extend flexibilities to a certain limit, and that's what you have here. Let me just talk about a couple of things that are also happening at ACCET. So again, we're trying to be forward thinking in terms of giving our institutions and their students additional options in terms of educational modalities and approaches to education. And so one of the things I know we've talked about for a while, but we are continuing to progress with it, is ACCET is currently doing a pilot to accredit bachelor's degree four-year programs. And we will be going to the Department of Education for expansion of scope so that ACCET is recognized to accredit bachelor's degree programs. So that is happening now. We're working with 3 institutions as part of this pilot. If you are interested in establishing bachelor's degree programs, please let me know, and perhaps you can be part of that pilot. The other that is happening is competency-based education. So ACCET is putting together, it has currently, I should say, a task force of very knowledgeable individuals to help us with a competency-based education template. Similar to the IDL template, it has specific field criteria that need to be met. That's basically additional standards for competency-based education, and it will also have additional supplementary questions that need to be answered by institutions as they submit their ACER if they have competency-based education. We are putting together a template for competency-based education in a course credit hour approach. We are not doing a direct assessment. So the competency-based education means that the institution is identifying competencies. Students have to demonstrate mastery of those competencies. There's a lot of assessment that goes as part of that. And there's some flexibility in student pacing as they go through their program with pacing and gating that happens. But we are planning for the commission at its August meeting to consider for the first time the draft template for competency-based education. It will then go out for comment. And so we welcome your review and comments on that. So I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has them.
Questions for Judy? Again, specific questions to your institution, why don't you hold for a few minutes and let's see if there's any questions for Judy about these additional temporary flexibilities. These were not in place, by the way, during our last webinar at the beginning of the month, on May 1st, when there were questions like this. We said, keep an eye. Well, here's the eye. They've been delivered. These are going to be very helpful to schools as they try to meet our deadlines. Particularly, I think the retroactive approval is going to be very valuable come June. Any other questions for Judy right now? Looks like we're set, Judy.
You're in the regulatory world, and you kind of glaze over after a certain
That's
point.
right. Everybody ready for a nap besides me? It's happy hour somewhere soon, right? So why don't we do this? We're going to stop the recording if you don't mind, Rez, and stop it right there, and then we'll hang on the line here for